In our previous video, we talked about organic molecules or macromolecules. Today, we're going to delve further into carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. By the end of this video, you should be able to recognize these macromolecules, and you should also be able to understand their structures and their functions. So first, let's dive into what is a macromolecule. Well, in biology, we're going to learn a lot of new words and a lot of new terms, so it's really important that we recognize word parts. The first word part I want to talk about in this video is the word macro. You should know that macro means large. Macroeconomics, macro means large. A molecule is a group of atoms that are bonded together, like these molecules below: water, glucose, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. So together, macromolecule means a large group of atoms bonded together. And that's exactly what a macromolecule or biomolecule or organic compound is. So macromolecules can be broken up into their monomers, and monomers are the small individual molecule, and this small individual molecule gets repeated over and over again. And it gets repeated over and over again until it creates something called a polymer. And you should know this prefix mono, that means one. And you should know this prefix poly, as in polygon or polygot, that means many. So a monomer is one small molecule. A polymer is these small molecules, these monomers, repeated all over and over and over again until they make a large molecule. And that polymer is a macromolecule. So here is a really good example that I like to look at. Here's some monomers, these cute little Lego pieces that we can see here. And as individual monomers, yeah, they're great, but they don't really have that many functions, right? But as we start to put them together into units of like 3, man, we can start to build a tower, we could build the start of a bridge, we can start to have more uses for these polymers, for these monomers that are now a polymer. And then here is a polymer of even more monomers, and that 5 monomer polymer becomes even more useful. So those monomers are the small individual pieces of a polymer. So a macromolecule or a polymer or an organic molecule or a biomolecule can be up from 4 to 1 million atoms large. They can be massive. And right here we see a pretty complex picture. I actually love this picture. It's a rendering of a protein that is within our bodies. And as we learn more about the body and about living things, we'll learn that proteins are such a fascinating part of our bodies. They have so many structures, so many functions. They're really important. And this is a picture of quite a large macromolecule, specifically of protein. So macromolecules are really important. All of our cells are made of macromolecules, and macromolecules are needed for life. Remember, we can put in the word biomolecule or organic compound or polymer here in our biology class. So there are 4 types of macromolecules. We talked about them before: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And you can see those 4 examples here. Here's our carbs, over here is our lipids, here's our proteins, and lastly our nucleic acids. So as we've talked about in previous presentations, we know that these macromolecules, these biological polymers, are made up of 4 main types of atoms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Most especially carbon. Remember, if they don't have carbon, they're no good. They are not an organic molecule. And 98% of the human body weight is actually made up of these atoms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And phosphorus and sulfur are also important, and we know that they are also a part of many of these biomolecules. So once again, just as a reminder, a polymer is a macromolecule that is made of similar small units bonded together. Here's our monomer, and they're joined together until they become a functional polymer that can do jobs around our bodies. Once again, a monomer is that smaller unit that makes up a polymer. So we know that we have these polymers. We have carbohydrates, we have proteins, we have lipids, we have nucleic acids. But you maybe have never heard about the smaller subunits or the monomers that make up these four biological polymers. Well, for carbohydrates, it's monosaccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide actually means sugar. So carbohydrates are made up of one sugar repeated over and over, over and over, over and over. So the monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid. The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid. Lipids technically do not have a polymer, but they are made up of fatty acids and glycerol. But because it's made up of two separate pieces, it's not a repeating monomer over and over again. Technically, that is not a monomer, and this should say monomer right here, not polymer. Whoops. And then last but not least, a nucleic acid, which is the polymer, is made up of nucleotides that are repeated over and over and over again, hundreds to thousands of times in order to create a nucleic acid. So let's talk a little bit about the roles of these macromolecules. First, let's talk about carbohydrates. We know that the monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. Carbohydrates are important. They provide the main source of quick energy for the body, and they also provide some structural support, especially in plants in the form of cellulose. And when we're looking at carbohydrates, we know that they can only contain 3 of our atoms that make up macromolecules. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And here's what you need to know. My ratio of hydrogen to oxygen will always exist in a 2-to-1 ratio. So if I do my number of hydrogens divided by my number of oxygens, I will always get 2. And that means I'm a carbohydrate. So for example, let's look at glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. And so if I want to know if glucose is a carbohydrate, I see that I have 12 hydrogens divided by 6 oxygens. And I know 12 divided by 6 is 2. So this is a carbohydrate. And I know that because it only contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that the carbon and hydrogen and oxygen that exists in it, the hydrogen and oxygen, is at a 2-to-1 ratio. Next, we're going to talk about lipids. So there are 3 main types of lipids. We have fats, steroids, and phospholipids, and they're really important for insulation, for energy storage, and also vitally important in the cell membrane. When we're trying to identify molecules as lipids, we know that they only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Wait a minute, isn't that the same as carbohydrates? Man, this is getting confusing. But don't worry, the H divided by O ratio, so H divided by O, will not equal 2. In fact, H divided by O is normally much larger than 2. So let's look at an example. So for this example, we're going to look at C18, H34O3. Well, we're going to put my number of hydrogens, which is 34, divided by my number of oxygens, which is 3. Oh my goodness, we know that this is going to be much larger than 2. In fact, we know when we do 34 divided by 3, we get 11.33 repeating. So this is clearly a lipid, right? The H divided by the O does not equal 2. Next, we're going to talk about proteins. Proteins, I would have to say, are my absolutely favorite macromolecule in the body. They're so interesting. Like I said, they have so many different functions. They make up enzymes, which are this really cool biological catalyst that we're going to spend an entire unit on. Proteins are cool. And I can't even list all of their structures and functions here because they are so important. They do so many things in our bodies. And when we're looking to identify proteins, we need to identify and look for the following atoms. It's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. Not always sulfur, sometimes sulfur. Awesome. Let's move on to our last, but definitely are not least, our friends, the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are great. They contain and store all of our hereditary info, specifically in DNA and RNA. So they're a really powerful macromolecule. And their monomer, like we've said before, are nucleotides. And the atoms that make up nucleic acids are carbon, as always, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So that is how you would identify a nucleic acid if you are given the macromolecules. So we're at the end of this presentation, and hopefully you learned the difference between monomers and polymers, the different monomers and the polymers that they make up, and how to identify those polymers and monomers, and hopefully you've understood the structure and the function of macromolecules.